In palaces built on protocol and portraits polished to perfection, the one thing no royal biography dares list is dependency. Behind the velvet curtains and crown-tipped silhouettes lies a secret history of compulsions, hushed, edited, denied. From opium in teacups to brandy before council, their addictions were never absent, just unseen. Because what do you do when your public face must never flinch, but your private life is quietly unraveling? This is the hidden story of 30 royals, and the vices they carried beneath the crown. Welcome to 30 British Royals with Secret Addiction. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, not just for more mysteries, but because the royal curtain never lifts without a little help. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments and tell us what time it is where you are. Midnight? Noon? Or somewhere in between? Let's see who else is wandering the halls of royal history with you tonight. 1. King George IV, 1762 to 1830. History tends to remember King George IV as the flamboyant Prince Regent, a velvet-draped monarch with a flair for powdered wigs, waist-expanding banquets, and architectural vanity projects. But behind the brocade and bombast was a man quietly unraveling under the weight of a daily chemical contract. George wasn't just addicted to grandeur. He was addicted to the things that made him feel grand. Chief among them, alcohol and laudanum. Laudanum, for the uninitiated, was 19th century Britain's answer to everything. Toothache? Take laudanum. Melancholy? Laudanum. Heartbreak? Gout? Existential dread? Boredom at court? Yes, yes, and certainly yes. But George didn't take laudanum like the rest of his subjects, sparingly, guiltily, or with the resigned grimace of someone avoiding surgery. He took it like a man who had no idea where the line between pleasure and painkillers was supposed to be. He was also fond of alcohol in quantities that would have dropped a lesser man well before the coronation. Wine, brandy, punch, gin. If it was strong and numbed either his gout or his conscience, George drank it. Frequently. He was a monarch with a wine cellar so deep it required its own staff and, arguably, a support group. His dinners reportedly included dozens of dishes, not because he ate them all, but because indulgence had become its own performance. What makes George IV's story especially compelling and unsettling isn't just his dependency, but how utterly hidden it was behind a mirror-polished image. Official portraits showed him as a handsome, almost Romanesque figure of royal strength, despite the fact that, in reality, he had ballooned to over 20 stone and couldn't walk upstairs without assistance. Court painters literally airbrushed his figure into historical delusion. Public appearances were carefully staged, brief, and often replaced with double-speak-laden bulletins describing him as resting or recovering from minor ailments. One physician, in a private letter later made public, described his liver as the size of a small turkey. His bowels, it turns out, were not fit for an empire. Why did he spiral? Some point to the psychological fallout of his disastrous marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, a union that was more political hostage-taking than love story. Others cite the death of his daughter, Princess Charlotte, as a turning point. But maybe, just maybe, it was the burden of ruling a decaying empire through a body decaying faster than anyone dared admit. Palace insiders later admitted that managing George's mood swings and substance-induced episodes was a daily affair. One courtier wrote of the Prince Regent having fits of temper followed by hours of trembling silence. Physicians pumped him with additional tonics to soothe his pain, which likely included even more laudanum, creating a feedback loop of dependence. It was the royal version of turning up, hung over to your own life, day after day, century after century. Still, the public never quite saw it. George IV was marketed as a symbol of stability, tradition, and national grandeur, even as he stumbled, literally and metaphorically, through his final years. When he died, it was reported with the decorum reserved for gods. No mention of the bottles, the pills, the quiet collapses behind silk curtains. And so the myth of the royal image endured. Clean, stoic, invincible. But the truth lingered like cigar smoke behind the throne. The truth was that even kings can disappear into their dependencies. And sometimes, the more extravagant the mask, the more desperate the man beneath it. But George wasn't the only one hiding behind a haze of habit. In fact, his very son would ascend the throne dressed in charm and diplomacy, while secretly puffing his way through enough cigars to fog Buckingham itself. 2. King Edward VII, 1841 to 1910. If King George IV masked his addictions in velvet and portraits, his great-grandson King Edward VII camouflaged his vices with charm. The kind of charm that made people forget what you were doing with your other hand, or where your money was going, or how many cigars you'd smoked before breakfast. Before he became king, Edward spent 6 long decades as the Prince of Wales, effectively waiting for his mother, Queen Victoria, to die. She didn't. Not quickly, anyway. The result? A man with too much time, too much money, and too few responsibilities, which is a terrible combination for anyone, but catastrophic for a future monarch with an already compulsive personality. Edward's 2 great indulgences were gambling and tobacco, and not in the polite, occasional, this is how gentlemen pass time at the club way. No. Edward reportedly smoked 12 to 20 cigars a day, not counting his cigarette breaks. There are accounts of his cigars being specially imported, cut, and stored to his exact specifications, the way one might treat sacred relics. His cigars were his companions, in meetings, in carriages, at meals, even on his deathbed. They were also his armor, a constant, tangible assertion of control in a world where he controlled almost nothing, certainly not his mother or the political tides she steered alone. Gambling was less constant but more explosive. Edward was not a cautious bettor. He lost vast sums in Paris casinos, Monte Carlo backrooms, and stately British drawing rooms alike. One of his most infamous losses involved a private baccarat game in 1890 that became a full-blown scandal when it went public. British newspapers delicately danced around the details, suggesting indiscretions and unseemly conduct. But the truth, revealed by biographers decades later, was that Edward's presence had violated every protocol of royal neutrality. He wasn't just playing cards. He was losing money, compromising friends, and lending royal credibility to games that others would have been jailed for hosting. But somehow none of this stuck to him. Partly because he was funny, witty, likable. He had what they called a hearty appetite for life, which was society's euphemism for people who overate, overdrank, and overstayed their welcome, and who, crucially, had the good manners to tip well. Edward's vices became anecdotes, not scandals. That's how good his public relations were, or, more accurately, how good his friends were at keeping his secrets. Behind the scenes, palace aides tried to manage him, sometimes frantically. Private letters from his staff reveal mild panic about the king's public appearances, mostly due to the smoke clinging to his clothes and the gambling debts quietly arriving in the mail. One royal servant complained that his cigars invaded every fabric of the palace, from drapes to diplomacy. But no one dared confront him too directly. He was, after all, the heir to the throne, a title that still came with a certain untouchability. By the time Edward finally became king in 1901, he was already 59 and wheezing. The cigars had done their work. He reigned for just 9 years. But even in that short time, he maintained his image as the grand conciliator, a diplomat in tails, a king who understood both courts and casinos, who could charm a room before the smoke cleared. His addictions, though never acknowledged in official records, would later surface in memoirs and court gossip. But they never quite dented the myth. Why? Because Edward VII wasn't remembered as a man unraveling. He was remembered as a man who made vice look like leisure, and who, unlike his predecessors, never seemed particularly haunted by what he'd consumed or lost. But then came his son, George V. and with him, a very different kind of addiction. One not loud or scandalous, but quiet, methodical, and slowly lethal. Not a storm of indulgence, but a slow burn of dependence. 2 kings down, 28 to go, and we're only just peeling back the royal lacquer. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this descent into palace secrets. And tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it where you are? Morning coffee? Midnight spiral? Let us know in the comments. You're definitely not the only one up right now. 3. King George V, 1865 to 1936. If Edward VII smoked like a bon vivant on borrowed time, his son George V smoked like a man fulfilling a duty, as if the monarchy itself ran on nicotine and royal protocol in equal measure. Where Edward had gambled in lavish salons and laughed through scandal, George kept to strict routines, rigid timetables, and a brand of stoicism so severe it bordered on parody. And yet, beneath that cold, clipped exterior, George V nursed an addiction that was as relentless as it was ordinary. Cigarettes. Up to 20 a day, sometimes more. Not recreationally, religiously. Cigarettes were his constant companion, not a vice he indulged in, but a tool he relied on. In his personal notes and private correspondence, there are glimpses of a man who lit a cigarette not to celebrate, but to endure. Endure meetings, endure silence, endure the unbearable weight of being the king of a disintegrating empire. Unlike his father's flamboyant displays, George's dependence was internalized. Quiet, systematic, deeply habitual. In photos, his fingers are almost always positioned in that familiar posture, even when no cigarette is visible, as if the body had already memorized the ritual long before the mind did. Doctors noticed. So did his staff. But the public didn't. They weren't supposed to. Early 20th century royal PR was a carefully curated machine, and the image of King George V was one of unyielding stability. Newspapers praised his austere virtue and iron discipline, even as royal physicians quietly tried to manage his worsening bronchitis, emphysema, and chronic inflammation of the throat, all steadily fueled by the cigarette breaks that were never, ever skipped. And even when illness threatened to topple the king, as it did many times in the 1920s and 30s, the official narrative stayed loyal. Statements from the palace referred to minor ailments or brief recoveries. Meanwhile, George was receiving oxygen treatments behind closed doors, struggling with labored breathing and being injected with drugs just to keep him upright for state duties. According to private diaries later released by royal aides, his morning routine began with tea, a smoke, and silence, a kind of secular sacrament for a monarch who, outwardly, had everything in control. But of course, he didn't. He ruled a collapsing empire, a family torn apart by revolution and exile, and a public losing its patience for crowns and ceremony. His addiction wasn't a flamboyant rebellion or a scandalous secret. It was a quiet collapse, a daily compromise. One more cigarette to get through one more briefing, one more appearance, one more moment of pretending that everything was fine. His death in 1936 was officially attributed to lung issues, though the exact circumstances were edited. Famously, his physician administered a final injection of morphine and cocaine, not to save him, but to ensure he died in time for the morning papers. Even in death, the performance mattered more than the reality. The man who had inhaled his way through 2 world wars and an imperial unraveling had to exit on schedule, with dignity, and preferably without coughing. His addiction was never acknowledged by the monarchy. But it didn't need to be. The yellowed fingertips, the rasping voice, the hollowed lungs, they told the story. His legacy became one of duty and steadiness. But if you looked closer, you could see the cost of that image in every exhale. And while George V's habits were carefully framed as stress coping mechanisms, his son, the famously anxious George VI, would inherit not just the throne, but the same reliance on smoke and drink. Only this time, the anxiety wasn't just inherited. It was audible, trembling, and eventually fatal. 4. King George VI, 1895 to 1952. In the pantheon of reluctant kings, George VI stands alone. Not for his achievements, but for the visible, almost painful effort it took him to perform royalty at all. History remembers him as the quiet hero of wartime Britain, the stammering king who found his voice just in time to rally a nation. But behind that noble narrative was a man so racked with anxiety that he turned to two companions he could count on to calm his nerves: alcohol and cigarettes. And like his father before him, he relied on them not as indulgences, but as necessities. George VI didn't crave vice, he required sedation. From childhood he was the overlooked spare, the second son with the stiff posture and uncertain voice, raised in the shadow of his charismatic older brother, Edward VIII. No one, including himself, expected him to wear the crown. When his brother abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, George VI was thrust into a role he never wanted and likely never should have had. And he coped the only way he knew how, with ritual, restraint, and a quietly escalating dependence on things that dulled the edges of royal life. The cigarette habit started early and intensified quickly. By his 30s, George VI was smoking more than a pack a day. By his 40s, that number had doubled. His aides, loyal to the royal script, filtered his public image carefully, never showing the ashtrays that followed him from room to room or the nervous pacing that often preceded major speeches. Photographs were selected with surgical precision to conceal how thin he had grown, how gray his skin had become, and how sunken his eyes looked during state appearances. If the monarchy was a performance, George VI was the stagehand who never got to leave the spotlight, always acting, never comfortable. And then there was the drinking. Unlike his father, who drank with ceremony, George VI drank quietly, consistently, and with increasing frequency. His preferred drink was gin, but he wasn't particularly choosy. Alcohol was used to lubricate the royal stiffness, to get through the speeches, the inspections, the unbearable silence of duty. Former staff have recounted how he would take a stiff drink before a broadcast, then chain smoke through his recovery from the effort. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival. Doctors noticed. Of course they did, but they tread lightly, offering euphemisms and half measures. His health began to fail in the 1940s, but public statements insisted he was recovering, resting, or engaged in light duties. The truth was much starker. He was slowly collapsing under the weight of expectation and the poisons he used to meet it. In 1951, he underwent surgery for lung cancer, though the word cancer was never officially uttered in public. The surgery removed part of his left lung, but he resumed public duties almost immediately, wrapped in scarves, flanked by aides, smiling through pain. That same year, he appeared at London's airport to bid farewell to his daughter, Elizabeth, who was departing on a royal tour. It would be the last time they saw each other. He died in his sleep in 1952 at the age of 56, a king worn down by war, anxiety, and decades of self-medication. The official cause was coronary thrombosis, a phrase that politely tiptoes around the reality of a body slowly poisoned by stress, smoke, and silence. The public mourned a beloved, steady monarch, but few knew the full cost of that steadiness. He had inherited a throne he never wanted, endured a voice that betrayed him, and turned to two quiet addictions to bridge the unbearable gap between duty and self. And yet, in death as in life, the mask of royal dignity remained intact. But the next royal in this lineage didn't just sip cocktails behind palace walls. She turned afternoon gin into a full-time routine, one that blurred the line between aristocratic leisure and quiet dependence. 5. Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother, 1900 to 2002. She was the smiling matriarch of the monarchy, the Queen Mum, with pearls as permanent as her composure and a handbag that seemed to carry nothing but decorum. To the public, Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother was the very embodiment of British resilience. The woman who refused to flee London during the Blitz, who waved from palace windows like a porcelain figurine untouched by fear, who outlived nearly everyone she'd ever known with a grin that bordered on supernatural. But behind the gin and smiles persona was a quieter truth, rarely acknowledged in polite company. She drank, not scandalously, not ruinously, but persistently, regularly. Enough that those closest to her stopped seeing it as a habit and started treating it as routine. Her drink of choice? A specific concoction, gin and Dubonnet. Equal parts, 2 slices of lemon, with the rind left on. It was mixed for her by palace staff multiple times a day, reportedly starting before lunch, often continuing into the afternoon, and again in the evening. This was no raucous party girl tale. This was British aristocracy's version of a controlled drip, elegant, refined, and never publicly spoken of. And that's the key. It was never spoken of. For decades, the Queen Mother's drinking was folded into the broader myth of her indomitable spirit. Her fondness for a drink was treated with affectionate euphemism. Her daily tipple. A little something to keep her going. Biographers, especially those writing during her lifetime, treated the subject gingerly, as if revealing too much might disrupt the national equilibrium. But insiders told a more textured story. Former palace staff, after retirement and with careful phrasing, noted that her days were punctuated by alcohol, in the way others might schedule tea. A former footman once remarked, "The drinks tray was as regular as the schedule for the dogs." Another attendant, anonymously quoted years later, described the palace as running on ritual, and one of those rituals was cocktails. Still, no one ever accused her of being out of control. That wasn't the point. Her relationship with alcohol was quiet, measured, and, in its own way, inviolable. It wasn't excess in the classical sense. It was endurance. The Queen Mother had lived through 2 world wars, the death of a husband, the abdication crisis, and the near dismantling of the monarchy, and throughout it all, she had kept up appearances, kept the hats tilted just right, kept the smile steady, and if that required a few glasses of fortified wine before dinner, well, that was her business, and the business of precisely no one else. What's most intriguing, and perhaps unsettling, is how thoroughly this dependence was normalized. It never made headlines. It never sparked concern. The royal myth machine had already cast her as untouchable. The Queen Mother, the last empress, the national grandmother. In that version of the story, gin wasn't a crutch. It was a character detail. But the habit was real, and so was its quiet control over her daily rhythm. And while her public image remained untouched, her daughter, Princess Margaret, would not be granted the same luxury of concealment. Where the Queen Mother's drinking was wrapped in nostalgia and pearls, Margaret's would be draped in scandal, smoke, and the slow unraveling of a woman trying to outrun her own legend. 6. Princess Margaret, 1930 to 2002. If the Queen Mother drifted through royal life on a cloud of Dubonnet and discretion, Princess Margaret crash-landed through it with a martini in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Or at least that's how the tabloids told it. She was everything her sister, Queen Elizabeth II, was not. Glamorous, defiant, impulsive, emotional. But beneath the shimmering veneer of tiaras and Caribbean getaways was a woman quietly undone by the very stage she was born onto. Her addictions, to alcohol, to cigarettes, to prescription pills, and perhaps most fatally, to being seen, were less hidden than tolerated, until they weren't. Margaret was the younger sister, the spare, a position she seemed to resent and relish in equal measure. Her early life was spent in the gilded echo of her sister's destiny. She would never be queen, but she would always be royal. She played the role with flair. She smoked in public, danced in nightclubs, wore red nail polish at a time when red meant rebellion, and turned up to state events looking like a Vogue editorial had accidentally wandered into Westminster Abbey. She was, by all accounts, magnetic, but that magnetism came with a price. The ceaseless expectation to perform, and the equally relentless scrutiny when she faltered. Margaret's dependence on alcohol didn't begin with drama. It began with ritual. Like many royals before her, she had her daily timetable of drinks. A whiskey before lunch, wine with the meal, a port or brandy after. Over time, those rituals hardened into routine, and the routine quietly took over. Friends and former aides later recalled how her sharp wit would fade as the day wore on, replaced by slurred words, icy moods, and long silences. What had once been Margaret being Margaret gradually became something more tragic. Margaret disappearing inside herself. Her cigarette addiction was equally unrelenting. She reportedly smoked up to 60 a day for decades. And when the pressures of royal life mounted, or when the party ended and the guests had gone home, there were pills to even the highs and blur the lows. Sedatives, tranquilizers, sleeping aids, all prescribed, all legal, all part of the performance. Still, the palace tried to keep up appearances. For years, Margaret's drinking was written off as eccentricity, her smoking as a generational quirk. The public saw the laughter, the lavish holidays, the scandalous romances. They didn't see the private collapses, the missed appointments, or the days spent in bed behind shuttered curtains. Even after a series of strokes in the 1990s, the language remained polite. Health complications, mobility issues. Few mentioned the long history of physical decline that had, by then, become impossible to ignore. When Margaret died in 2002, she was 71, younger than many of her royal relatives, but visibly diminished. The rebellious sparkle had long since faded. Her legacy remains complicated, a woman both trapped and defined by her title, who burned bright, fast, and ultimately alone. But her story wasn't unique, not even close. Because nearly 400 years earlier, another royal, far more powerful and even more feared, had also lost himself to compulsive consumption. Not cocktails and tabloids, but feasts and early opiates, wrapped in a myth of majesty that made his downfall all the more monstrous. 7. King Henry VIII, 1491 to 1547. Long before Buckingham Palace had a press office, before the House of Windsor discovered the art of damage control, and before addiction was something quietly managed behind velvet curtains, there was Henry VIII, a monarch who needed no concealment because his power made truth optional. He was England's most infamous king, a force of nature with 6 wives, an appetite for supremacy, and a waistline that grew in tandem with his authority. Publicly, he was strength incarnate. Privately, he was a man physically breaking down, kept upright by compulsive eating, wine-soaked excess, and early forms of pain relief that modern medicine would recognize as narcotic dependence. In his youth, Henry was athletic, magnetic, a Renaissance poster boy with a jousting lance and a Latin education. But by middle age, he was obese, immobile, and suffering from a litany of health problems, chronic leg ulcers, insomnia, gout, and mood swings that made court life a daily gamble. To manage the pain, both physical and, one suspects, psychological, Henry relied on what his court physicians called soothing tonics. These were no herbal teas. They were crude precursors to modern opiates, tinctures of poppy, extracts of mandrake, even compounds laced with mercury. They dulled the agony in his legs, which had turned septic and reeked so badly that even loyal courtiers struggled to stay near him. They soothed his erratic sleep. They calmed his bursts of fury. They also, inevitably, took their toll. His letters in later years became erratic, his judgments more paranoid, and his relationship with food even more extreme. Feasts became therapy. Tables buckled under the weight of pies, meats, and sweet wines, as if culinary abundance could smother physical decay. His portraits, famously idealized, show a king towering in armor, resolute and commanding. The truth was far less flattering. By the 1540s, Henry needed a mechanical hoist to lift his body into bed, yet no one dared speak of dependence. Addiction as a concept didn't exist, especially not for kings. If Henry demanded wine with breakfast and opium with dinner, it was treated not as vice but prerogative. Even his physicians, who privately noted his worsening condition, couched their language in euphemism. The king requires his tincture. His Majesty rests better with the cordial. It was loyalty by omission. Modern historians, poring over court records and medical notes, have slowly pieced together what no one dared name at the time. Henry VIII was medicating himself into functionality. His famed volatility, the executions, the rages, the sudden religious reversals, were perhaps less divine inspiration and more chemical fluctuation. A monarch both enabled and eroded by the substances meant to keep him going. And yet, even as his body failed him, the myth endured. Power insulated him from scrutiny, and time polished him into legend. The bloated, medicated, pain-ridden man became, in national memory, a colossus in armor. But Henry wasn't the only monarch to weaponize contradiction. A century later, another king would condemn a vice from the pulpit, while quietly indulging it in private, until the line between moral crusade and personal hypocrisy vanished in a cloud of smoke. 8. King James I of England, 1566 to 1625. In 1604, King James I published a scathing essay titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, a rhetorical masterpiece that lambasted smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. It was the kind of fiery moral condemnation that made it clear this king would not tolerate the creeping, smoldering threat of tobacco. And yet, as is often the case in royal circles, the story was less straightforward, because while James may have written the most famous anti-smoking manifesto of the era, evidence suggests he didn't always practice what he so grandly preached. In his younger years, long before England's throne had been handed to him like a poisoned chalice, James VI of Scotland was surrounded by courtiers who smoked liberally, a fashion imported from the Spanish and Portuguese nobility. Tobacco, then a luxury, was offered in pipes as part of elite social ritual. Early letters and anecdotes from Scottish courtiers hint at a young James who partook with tolerance during social functions, especially in the 1580s, when tobacco was still considered medicinal by some and exotic by all. Later in life, once he became king of both Scotland and England, James underwent a transformation, politically, religiously, and rhetorically. The tobacco essay was part of a broader attempt to style himself as a moral shepherd of the nation, one who stood above vice, above hypocrisy, and certainly above the growing trend of smoky tavern indulgences that were, in his view, corrupting the masses. The text itself is as theatrical as it is moralistic, drawing comparisons between tobacco smoke and the horrible stink of hell. And yet, within court walls, the king's actual relationship with the substance was far less clean-cut. Some historians believe his fiery anti-tobacco stance was born less from principle and more from personal frustration, possibly with his own early use. While there is no direct account of James being a lifelong smoker, several contemporary sources, including Spanish diplomatic letters and court gossip from visiting French nobles, refer obliquely to a habit abandoned in youth. One ambassador even suggested the king's distaste for smoking was rehearsed too often, as if to forget a former affection. Whether or not he was truly addicted or merely experimented and recoiled remains unclear. But what is certain is that James spent much of his reign policing not just the public's behavior, but his own image. His fierce anti-smoking campaign conveniently aligned with his economic interests, allowing him to heavily tax imported tobacco while condemning its use. A royal sleight of hand that looked like virtue but smelled a bit like strategy. What makes James's story resonate is not whether he smoked in secret or just flirted with the habit in youth. It's that his need to publicly disavow it, loudly, aggressively, and in published form, speaks to the deep tension between the private self and the performative monarch. A tension echoed centuries later by another royal woman, frail, grieving, and quietly slipping brandy into her bedside glass while the world praised her as Britain's last great queen. 9. Queen Anne, 1665 to 1714. To the public, Queen Anne was a symbol of frailty and divine endurance. A pious, soft-spoken monarch who suffered greatly, reigned reluctantly, and prayed constantly. History has not remembered her with grandeur. She was the last Stuart monarch plagued by tragedy, surrounded by war, and seemingly composed of equal parts mourning and devotion. But what's often forgotten, or intentionally reframed, is that beneath her solemn exterior was a lifelong struggle with pain, both physical and emotional. And into that silence, something else crept in. Alcohol. Anne's reign was one of contradiction. She was both monarch and mourner, ruler and recluse. She lost 17 children, through miscarriages, stillbirths, and early deaths. That's not a statistic. It's a persistent trauma, compounded by chronic illnesses like gout and what was then vaguely labeled as dropsy, a term encompassing a range of ailments from heart failure to swelling limbs. She could barely walk in her final years, needing assistance or being wheeled in a sedan chair. But even in her weakest moments, she was expected to appear regal, strong, in command. And so, like many royals before and after her, she found a private remedy. Contemporary letters, court diaries, and even veiled poems suggest that Anne relied increasingly on wine and brandy. Not in the public eye, but in private chambers, where a queen could be human without consequence. Her use of alcohol was rarely, if ever, mentioned directly in formal records. It was cloaked in euphemism. Medicinal comforts. Soothing elixirs. The cordial cup. One court physician, in a letter not intended for publication, remarked that the Queen's evening tonics were of the strengthening kind, laced, though discreetly so. Those close to her knew. Her ladies-in-waiting sometimes found her asleep in the afternoons, having excused herself from meetings with a headache. Ministers spoke in hushed tones about her withdrawn temperament and fatigued mind. And her famously complicated relationships, especially with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, took on an increasingly erratic tone in her letters, which some historians believe were influenced by a combination of pain, medication, and wine. The politics of the time demanded a stoic monarch, and Anne tried to comply. She attended church dutifully, sponsored religious scholarship, and avoided the flamboyance that had tainted previous rulers. But behind the curtain, the reality was more intimate and more human. Alcohol wasn't her rebellion, it was her balm, a way to manage the unbearable weight of grief, expectation, and physical decline. And in an era before antidepressants or effective painkillers, wine was often the only available relief that didn't come with leeches or bloodletting. Unlike her successors, Anne didn't have the benefit of a modern palace PR machine. Yet even so, the court was careful to manage her image. When she missed public events, official statements cited her infirmities. When she stumbled or slurred, it was the fever or the swelling. No mention of the glass of brandy that may have steadied her hand or blurred the world just enough to survive another state meeting. Anne died at the age of 49, exhausted, bloated, and heavily medicated, both by her doctors and her own devices. Officially, the cause was listed as complications from gout and dropsy. But behind that diagnosis was a life spent managing constant pain with quiet dependence. And yet, Anne wasn't the first royal to hide vulnerability behind ritualized excess. Just a generation before, another monarch known for his libertine charm had his own nightly ritual. One laced not only with pleasure but with tonics, powders, and the medicinal poisons of his age. 10. King Charles II, 1630 to 1685. King Charles II was known as the Merry Monarch, but that merriment was never free. Behind the endless revelry, countless mistresses and candlelit masquerades lay a restless energy that never quite settled, and a daily chemical regimen designed to keep it all going. Charles didn't just indulge in the pleasures of the flesh and the thrills of the court. He also relied on a steady stream of 17th-century tonics and elixirs, many of them laced with opium, mercury, and other early narcotics, to mask the growing cost of a life lived at full speed. To his admirers, Charles was the charming king who brought the court back to life after the grim austerity of the Puritan interregnum. He reintroduced music, theater, fashion, and flirtation into the bloodstream of Britain. But to his physicians, and he had many, he was a patient of mounting contradictions. Athletic and energetic by day, yet plagued by insomnia and trembling fatigue by night. His solution? Medicinal cordials, the kind sold in gold-trimmed bottles and prescribed by royal apothecaries with reassuring names like the King's Strengthening Draught or Sovereign Water of Life. But beneath the poetic branding were ingredients we'd now recognize as highly addictive. Records from Charles's apothecaries reveal an astonishing array of concoctions. Tinctures with laudanum, an opium derivative, tonics containing powdered pearls and bezoars, and nightly restoratives laced with substances that would make a modern toxicologist wince. These were not casual comforts, they were daily routines. Part placebo, part poison, part coping mechanism. While Charles rarely showed weakness in public, his correspondence with his doctors tells a different story. Headaches, fatigue, chest tightness, periods of low mood, and the occasional paralysis in his limbs. His health problems weren't always visible, but they were chronic, and they were treated with the full chemical cabinet of the Restoration era. His dependence on medicinal stimulants and sedatives wasn't uncommon among royals. What made Charles unique was how seamlessly it was woven into his image. While his father, Charles I, had been remembered as solemn and tragic, Charles II reinvented the monarchy as an ongoing masquerade. He threw balls during political crises. He made jokes during parliamentary debates. And when his body began to rebel, he simply upped the dosage. His reputation as a lover of life, a tireless partier, a patron of the arts, all of it was sustained by a body increasingly sustained by artificial means. The irony? Many of the same physicians who dosed him with these remedies would later scramble to save him from them. In the final weeks of his life, Charles suffered what was officially described as a sudden illness. Likely a stroke, possibly made worse by decades of strain and substance exposure. The royal physicians bled him, purged him, blistered him, and dosed him again, a full spectrum of 17th-century treatments that read now like a slow-motion disaster. It's said he died surrounded by alchemists and astrologers, with jars of powdered amber and opium tincture within reach. But to the public he remained the merry monarch to the end, generous, charming, and gone too soon. The rituals of medicine had been disguised as vitality, and the body breaking down beneath the crown was never fully shown. Still, Charles was not the only royal to indulge both his vices and his image. One of his own nephews would inherit not just the throne, but a taste for risk, a man whose debts were quietly forgiven by Parliament, whose nightly excesses were politely redacted, and whose addiction left more than just receipts. It left a royal trail of silence. 11. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, 1763-1827. He may be remembered in nursery rhymes as the general who marched his men to the top of the hill and marched them down again. But Prince Frederick, Duke of York, left a far more tangible legacy than poetic missteps. He was the second son of King George III, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, and the man whose military reforms shaped Britain's defense system for decades. He was also, quietly, a compulsive gambler and a heavy drinker, a royal who played fast and loose not only with strategy but with staggering sums of money, much of it not his own. To the public, Frederick was the respectable face of the military establishment, calm, competent, and disciplined. But behind the scenes, he had a well-known weakness for cards, dice, and the soft haze of expensive wine. Gambling was a social norm among the aristocracy of the time, but Frederick took it to extremes. He played obsessively and recklessly, often losing more than he could afford. Of course, afford is a relative term when you're funded by the British taxpayer and shielded by royal privilege. Still, his debts mounted with alarming speed. Contemporary letters from creditors, intercepted court documents, and even whispers from fellow officers reveal a man who lived in a perpetual financial scramble. He borrowed frequently. He repaid slowly. And on more than one occasion, he required direct intervention from Parliament to bail him out, not publicly, of course, but behind closed doors, through delicate negotiations and carefully worded financial rearrangements. Royal dignity, after all, had to be preserved, even when it was deeply in debt. The wine didn't help. Frederick's love of drink wasn't scandalous by 18th century standards, but it was consistent, bordering on ritual. He drank to unwind, to celebrate, to forget, often late into the night after long evenings of gambling or court engagements. Friends later noted his declining health and frequent absences, but they remained loyal. The Duke, after all, was a royal. His habits weren't treated as problems. They were treated as personality traits. Still, the mask slipped occasionally. One of the rare public cracks came during the Mary Ann Clark scandal, a widely publicized affair in which Frederick's former mistress was accused of selling army commissions, allegedly with his knowledge or at least his willful ignorance. The scandal nearly ruined him. Though he denied involvement, the press had a field day, and he was temporarily forced to resign his military post. His gambling and drinking were never cited directly, but biographers have long noted how his personal chaos may have made him more vulnerable to manipulation. Despite all of this, Frederick returned to public service and died with his reputation mostly restored. History prefers to remember him as the army reformer, the royal uncle, the man who professionalized British defense. His private dependencies were edited out, like footnotes no one dared read aloud. But Frederick's story, like so many royal stories, is a reminder that beneath every uniform and title was a human being trying and often failing to manage the pressure of performance. And just as Frederick reached for wine and cards, another royal, ruling a vast empire from behind a black veil of mourning, reached for something far more potent, a tincture of grief and numbness, packaged in a bottle of laudanum. 12. Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901. Queen Victoria ruled for over 60 years, presiding over an empire so vast it was said the sun never set on it. She was the image of dutiful widowhood, national stability, and imperial resolve. But beneath the jet-black dresses and austere proclamations was a woman quietly medicating herself through decades of grief, a queen whose emotional world was managed not only through ritual and tradition, but through regular use of laudanum and chloroform. To understand her dependence, one must first understand her loss. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria went into mourning, not just in the performative royal sense, but in a complete psychological retreat. She wore black for the rest of her life, withdrew from public life for years, and instructed that her husband's rooms be maintained exactly as he'd left them. The world saw mourning as her moral statement, but for Victoria it was something more enduring, a wound that never fully closed. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, was common in Victorian medicine. Sold without prescription, marketed as a cure-all, and quietly addictive, it was used for everything from headaches to melancholia. Victoria's doctors prescribed it in carefully worded doses to help her sleep, to manage stress, to ease her vapors, or nerves, as they called it then. Of course, these euphemisms obscured the reality. The Queen was taking an opiate regularly, for emotional and psychological pain that no public gesture could soothe. Her diaries, though carefully edited by her daughter Beatrice, still hint at the dependency. Phrases like "took my drops," "required my cordial," and "soothed by the doctor's draft" appear at moments of stress or sorrow, after meetings with difficult ministers, after anniversaries of Albert's death, after public appearances that left her drained and shaking. Physicians at court noted that the Queen developed an increasing tolerance over the years, requiring slightly stronger doses to achieve the same calming effect. Then came chloroform, the fashionable new anesthetic of the mid-19th century. When Victoria gave birth to her 8th and 9th children, she used chloroform as a pain reliever, a controversial choice at the time. Critics accused her of defying natural maternal suffering, but Victoria was unapologetic. In private letters, she referred to it as blessed and soothing beyond description. It was another quiet turn toward chemical comfort in a life ruled by ritual and repression. Of course, none of this was made public. The image of Victoria, especially later in life, was fiercely protected. She was the grandmother of Europe, the matriarch of monarchy, the figurehead of moral Victorian values. The idea that she might have been regularly sedating herself with narcotic tinctures did not fit the narrative. Her dependency was sanitized into footnotes, her grief into legend. Yet even legends are human. And Victoria's reliance on substances was not about escape. It was about containment, of sorrow, of anxiety, of the immense pressure of personifying an empire while quietly unraveling behind closed doors. But she wasn't the only royal who died young with secrets buried beneath official statements. Her grandson, Albert Edward, Duke of Clarence, was next in line for the throne, until he vanished into royal myth, surrounded by whispers, scandal, and a death that never quite added up. 13. Prince Albert Edward, Duke of Clarence, 1864 to 1892. He was the heir who almost was, a royal ghost who flickered briefly between two monarchs before vanishing into historical footnotes and conspiracy theories. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, eldest son of the future King Edward VII and grandson of Queen Victoria, was once poised to inherit the British throne. Instead, he died at just 28, leaving behind more questions than answers. Officially, the cause was pneumonia, contracted during a bout of influenza. Unofficially, the story is far less tidy. Whispers of addiction to alcohol, morphine, and the comforts of quiet oblivion have long clung to the edges of his short, strange life. By all appearances, Albert Victor was the perfect royal heir, handsome, well-dressed, and dutiful in public. But even his earliest tutors noted he struggled to focus, describing him as amiable but vague, with a tendency to retreat into his own world. He was shuttled between schools, given various military postings, and traveled the empire in an attempt to season him into leadership. None of it took. Behind closed doors, court insiders worried about his mental stamina and emotional fragility. He wasn't a disaster, but he wasn't promising either. And so began the slow, polite sidelining of a royal no one quite knew what to do with. By his 20s, Albert Victor had developed a reputation, not for scandal per se, but for softness. He preferred leisure to leadership, comfort to command. He was said to be easily led, often by those with far sharper instincts and far fewer restrictions. During his time in the military, fellow officers noted his increasing fondness for brandy and other liquors. Rumors surfaced, never confirmed, always denied, that he was using morphine, a fashionable sedative of the time often prescribed for everything from insomnia to nervous conditions. His letters during this period grow sparse and short, as if even writing had become too much of an effort. The press, ever loyal to the palace in that era, never exposed these habits. But members of the household later confided that Albert Victor was closely monitored and, at times, quietly sequestered to avoid public scrutiny. Aides managed his social schedule carefully, limiting appearances when he seemed especially unwell or erratic. His engagement to Princess Mary of Teck, the future Queen Mary, was announced, but insiders questioned whether the match was truly meant to proceed or merely staged to quell speculation about his declining state. Then came his final illness in 1892. Influenza, they said. Pneumonia, they added. But the rapidity of his decline and the vague language in official bulletins left room for doubt. Biographers writing decades later, with access to less sanitized records, pointed to the possibility of complications from prolonged substance use. Respiratory failure worsened by a weakened immune system and a long history of sedation. But the royal narrative had already been written. A tragic young prince, taken too soon, mourned by a nation. His younger brother George would go on to become George V. Princess Mary would marry him instead. And Albert Victor? He faded into a kind of sanctioned forgetfulness. Not disgraced, but erased. His addictions, if ever fully understood, were buried with him at Windsor Castle, beneath marble and myth. But the pattern wouldn't stop there. Another royal, this one a reserved naval officer turned unlikely king, would also find himself dependent on quiet cups of spirits. His story, like Albert Victor's, was managed carefully, revealed only in fragments. Except this one would actually wear the crown and carry his addiction straight into the throne room. 14. Princess Alice of Battenberg, 1885 to 1969. At first glance, Princess Alice of Battenberg might not appear to belong on a list of royals with hidden addictions. She wasn't a monarch, never held a throne, and didn't frequent the social scenes of Europe's elite. But Alice's life was far more complex, and in many ways far more haunting than the tiaras and royal bloodlines would suggest. She was born into royalty, married into royalty, and gave birth to royalty. But for much of her adult life, Alice existed on the shadowed edge of the royal world, out of view, out of reach, and medicated into silence. Alice, the mother of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was born deaf but learned to lip-read in multiple languages, a remarkable achievement that only scratched the surface of her sharp mind and stubborn spirit. In her youth she was charming, intelligent, and deeply religious. But after marrying Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, her life began to spiral through decades of political exile, war, and personal instability. The instability eventually took on a clinical form. In the 1930s, after a period of increasingly erratic behavior, Alice was diagnosed with what was then loosely labeled as schizophrenia. But the diagnosis itself is still debated by historians and psychologists, partly because psychiatry at the time was a murky science, and partly because Alice's symptoms were as spiritual as they were psychological. She claimed to receive divine revelations, believed she had healing powers, and became obsessed with religious visions. To her aristocratic relatives and medical minders, it was too much. She was institutionalized in a Swiss sanatorium, reportedly against her will. What followed was a period of enforced sedation, the kind that was common in pre-war Europe but rarely spoken of afterward. Records indicate that Alice was heavily medicated with early tranquilizers and sedatives, likely barbiturates and related compounds that suppressed both her visions and her voice. She wasn't addicted in the recreational sense. She was medicated into compliance, not because she chose it, but because those around her did. Her spiritual experiences, genuine or otherwise, were reclassified as symptoms. Her eccentricity was rewritten as illness. The royal family remained largely silent about this chapter of her life. Her children were told little. Prince Philip, her son, was separated from her during her institutionalization. Letters between royal courtiers suggest that her condition was treated as a private embarrassment, a subject to be avoided, corrected, or buried. And for a time, Alice vanished from public view entirely. But remarkably, she returned. In the 1940s, amid the devastation of World War II, Alice re-emerged in Athens as a nun, founding a religious order and devoting herself to nursing the sick and hiding Jewish families from the Nazis. Her recovery was as mysterious as her breakdown. There are no detailed medical records, no definitive explanation. She had simply found a new calling, a new identity, and left the sedatives behind. Still, the years she spent under medical watch, subdued and sequestered, leave a lingering question. Was she truly ill, or simply uncontainable by the standards of her time? And how many other royals, labeled eccentric or unstable, were medicated into invisibility? Because just a few decades later, another royal, dashing, glamorous, and very much in the public eye, would also be living a double life. A prince adored by the press, respected by the military, and hiding a far more dangerous habit, a long-standing dependence on morphine and cocaine. 15. Prince George, Duke of Kent, 1902-1942. To the public, Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the modern royal, urbane, handsome, and effortlessly cosmopolitan. He was the younger brother of King Edward VIII and King George VI, the first royal to work at a civilian job, and a man often described as both charming and enigmatic. But behind the tailored uniforms and movie star smile was a life marked by secrecy, contradictions, and an addiction that would eventually become impossible to fully conceal. Prince George was, in many ways, a man caught between centuries. He embodied the elegance of aristocracy, yet craved the freedom of the ordinary. He worked at the Foreign Office, learned to fly planes, and surrounded himself with artists, actors, and musicians. A circle far less polished than traditional court company, but infinitely more alive. He moved through elite social scenes across Europe, a regular at parties in Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. And wherever he went, so did his dependencies. Unlike other royals whose addictions were cloaked in euphemism, George's struggle with morphine and cocaine has been documented in a surprising amount of detail. Not by palace press releases, of course, but by later biographers, declassified files, and the increasingly porous walls of post-war royal privacy. His drug use is believed to have begun in the late 1920s, possibly during a turbulent period of emotional instability and professional dissatisfaction. It wasn't just about escape. It was about control, or at least the illusion of it. Morphine dulled the sharp edges of stress. Cocaine sharpened the blunted ones. Together they created a cycle that was difficult to exit. Those close to him reported extreme mood swings, bursts of manic energy followed by periods of deep withdrawal. In private, he was restless, unpredictable, often melancholic. In public, he remained magnetic, a carefully constructed performance that became harder to maintain. The royal family, as ever, acted with quiet decisiveness. There were interventions, whispered directives, and strategic deployments. George was given positions that required travel and structure, including a return to naval service and later, a post in the newly established Royal Air Force. On paper, he was serving his country. Behind the scenes, he was being managed, moved, redirected, contained. There are suggestions that MI5 kept informal tabs on his movements during this time, not for political betrayal, but out of concern that his lifestyle might spark embarrassment or worse, exposure. His sudden death in 1942, in a mysterious plane crash in northern Scotland, only deepened the intrigue. Officially, he was on a military mission. Unofficially, questions piled up. Why was he aboard a flight so far from active conflict? Why was there a civilian on board? Why did records surrounding the crash remain classified for decades? Conspiracy theories, as they tend to, filled the silence. But what remains, undisputed, is that George, for all his privilege and charisma, was a man quietly battling a chemical dependence that may have shaped, and possibly shortened, his life. In the end, his addiction wasn't publicly acknowledged. It was edited out, blurred into stories of wartime service and patriotic sacrifice. But the documents surfaced eventually, and the outlines became clear. A royal lost between image and identity, managing his role with substances powerful enough to mask the pressure but not erase the cost. And that pressure, to conform, to perform, to remain silent, would haunt more than just one generation. For another royal, his brother in fact, would carry a more understated burden. His addiction didn't glitter in the Parisian night or crash in the Highlands. It clinked quietly in glasses behind palace doors, a steady hum beneath a life of perceived duty. 16. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, 1900 to 1974. If Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the glamorous younger brother, full of risk and mystery, then Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was the opposite, dutiful, disciplined, and determined to stay out of the spotlight. He rarely gave interviews, kept his thoughts to himself, and remained largely absent from the public's imagination. A background royal who made no waves. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, there was a quieter struggle. Prince Henry carried his own secret, one that unfolded far from the public eye, a long-term dependence on alcohol. As the third son of King George V and Queen Mary, Prince Henry was born into a role that came with immense visibility but little real power. Like many spare heirs of his generation, he was nudged toward a military career, a traditional path for royals not expected to rule. He served with quiet distinction, first in the army and later in various ceremonial roles across the Commonwealth. There was never scandal, never sensational headlines. But there were patterns, and there were whispers. Unlike his more flamboyant brothers, Henry's drinking was never public or performative. It was private, consistent, and, according to several of his longtime aides, increasingly habitual as he aged. His reliance on alcohol was not seen as extraordinary in a time when heavy drinking was still woven into the fabric of upper-class masculinity. What made it remarkable was how long it lasted, and how carefully it was managed. Internal palace memos and later interviews with royal staff suggest that Henry drank daily, most often in the evenings but sometimes earlier. He wasn't known to be violent or erratic, just increasingly withdrawn. Over time, his public appearances grew less frequent, and his capacity for long speeches and extended tours diminished. Officially, this was chalked up to health concerns, fatigue, or the vague but convenient phrase, advancing age. But behind the scenes, there were growing concerns about his dependency. Letters from his private secretaries, now housed in royal archives, speak in cautious terms about His Royal Highness's delicate condition, and note adjustments to his schedule based on his readiness on certain days. Those close to him developed subtle strategies, limiting the duration of public events, ensuring that refreshments at official functions were discreetly controlled, and postponing early morning engagements when necessary. Yet, Henry remained loyal to the system that shielded him. He never publicly complained, never asked for sympathy, and never broke with protocol. His drinking didn't bring down the monarchy or spark media attention. It simply became part of the architecture of his life, a coping mechanism for a role that required unwavering composure but offered little purpose. When he suffered a series of strokes in the 1960s, the palace attributed his decline to natural causes. Few mentioned the long years of drinking that may have worsened his condition. He died in 1974, age 74, largely forgotten by the public but remembered within royal circles as a quiet presence. That's how they put it, quiet. A word that can mean loyal, but also lonely. And yet, Prince Henry's story is not isolated. It fits neatly into a lineage of royals who coped in silence, numbing themselves in ways the public was never meant to see. Even more curiously, his family tree includes another figure, one of the most mysterious and scandal-shrouded royals of the Victorian era, whose own struggles with alcohol and addiction were erased almost entirely from public memory. A prince whose life ended young, leaving behind not just a questionable legacy, but a well-managed royal cover-up. 17. Prince Albert Victor, 1864 to 1892. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, often referred to simply as Eddie, remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of the British monarchy. Officially, he was the eldest son of the future King Edward VII, second in line to the throne, and destined, however briefly, to become king. Unofficially, he was a young man adrift in a sea of expectation, poor health, and whispered scandal. His early death at 28 was publicly mourned as a tragedy of fate. But behind the royal condolences and grand funeral lies a more complex truth. Eddie's life was shadowed by chronic substance use, likely tied to alcohol and gambling, and carefully shielded from the public by palace discretion. From a young age, Albert Victor struggled to live up to the image expected of a future monarch. He was widely considered charming but intellectually limited, a polite way of saying he was easily distracted, easily influenced, and never quite grasped the full scope of his education or responsibilities. Tutors, military commanders, and political handlers found him frustrating to manage, though all admitted he was gentle in temperament and eager to please. That gentleness may have also been a vulnerability. Court gossip and unofficial accounts suggest that by his early 20s, Albert Victor had developed a strong taste for alcohol. Not uncommon for aristocrats of the time, but in his case, it appears to have become something more habitual. He was a regular at gentlemen's clubs known for card tables and late-night brandy. Several biographers point to frequent reports of him returning from social functions in a state not fit for public appearance, a diplomatic phrase likely standing in for visible intoxication. He was also rumored to have accumulated gambling debts, the extent of which has been difficult to quantify, thanks to an almost complete lack of formal documentation. A sign, perhaps, of just how efficiently the royal household managed such matters. Debts were paid, appearances were controlled, and stories were softened. As with so many royals, the palace machinery did not fix the problem. It merely erased the paper trail. Toward the end of his short life, Eddie's health began to fail. He appeared increasingly fatigued and prone to illness. The official narrative is that he contracted influenza during the 1891-92 pandemic, which developed into pneumonia and killed him within days. But there is compelling evidence that his immune system had already been weakened by years of heavy drinking, poor diet, and possible substance misuse. Some historians have even pointed to signs of morphine use, a common sedative of the time, often prescribed liberally for everything from nerves to insomnia. When he died, the outpouring of public grief was immediate and intense. Newspapers printed sentimental tributes, and Queen Victoria herself reportedly mourned his death deeply. The royal family pivoted quickly, reshuffling the line of succession without ever addressing the deeper implications of his lifestyle. His younger brother George would go on to become King George V, while Prince Albert Victor became something of a royal ghost, remembered more for what he might have been than what he truly was. His addictions, his weaknesses, his quiet unraveling, all were bundled into the broader Victorian ethos of repression and managed memory. Officially, he died a prince of promise. But privately, those closest to him knew he was already fading long before the fever took hold. And still the cycle continued. Because the throne has never guaranteed peace of mind, and in the next story, it was the weight of migraines and divine right that drove a king to rely on opiates cloaked as medicinal restoratives until his crown rested on clouds of carefully administered oblivion. 18. King William IV, 1765 to 1837. Before he was king, William IV had already lived enough lives for 3 biographies: sailor, scandal magnate, reluctant royal, and occasional political grenade. He was never supposed to reign. The third son of George III, he spent decades in the Royal Navy, where discipline was enforced with a rope and morale came bottled. And like many naval men of his time, William developed a taste for strong spirits early. one that would follow him from the deck of a warship straight into the drawing rooms of Buckingham Palace. Publicly, William styled himself as the Sailor King, a title he leaned into with both pride and pragmatism. It gave him relatability, grit, and just the right amount of distance from the pomp of monarchy. But it also concealed something else, a long-standing dependence on alcohol, honed not in palace gardens, but in the rough taverns and claustrophobic quarters of His Majesty's ships. It was a habit forged by harsh routines and hardened into ritual by decades of emotional insulation. William was known to drink heavily during his naval years, with rum, brandy, and fortified wines being the staples of an officer's table. His diaries, while sparse, include multiple references to bracing tonics and restoratives, taken before and after official duties. Friends and fellow officers noted his tendency to become increasingly erratic or excitable during evenings, a trait often brushed off as naval eccentricity, but now widely recognized by historians as signs of sustained, habitual drinking. By the time he returned fully to royal life, William had become known within the family as unpredictable, often blunt, and occasionally volatile, traits that didn't ease with age. When he unexpectedly became king in 1830, following the death of his brother George IV and the earlier death of his niece Charlotte, the nation braced for chaos. What it got was a ruler far more competent than expected, but also one whose private habits were closely managed by his household staff. Unlike his brother George IV, who masked his addictions with opulence and self-delusion, William didn't care to hide them so much as normalize them. He continued to drink daily, particularly in the evenings, and aides were often tasked with ensuring his private supply remained discreetly stocked and discreetly delivered. His temper, already sharp, could worsen after his third or fourth glass, and several prime ministers, including Lord Melbourne, developed the delicate art of navigating a tipsy monarch's rants without triggering a full constitutional crisis. To the public, William's flaws were recast as charm. He was rough around the edges, but that only proved he was real. A man of the people, a monarch who understood the deck as well as the throne. Satirical cartoons of the era often portrayed him with a raised glass, but not in cruelty, rather as a kind of national uncle, grumbling and half-soused, yet oddly lovable. When William died in 1837, he was 71, an age considered impressive, even kingly. He left behind no legitimate heirs, only a tangled personal life, and a mixed legacy of constitutional moderation and personal irregularity. His addiction, never formally acknowledged, was woven into the myth of the Sailor King. Rough, real, and impossible to polish. But behind him came a very different royal, one who cloaked his pain behind prayer, migraines, and tinctures. A king whose piety didn't shield him from dependence, but perhaps deepened it. 19. King Charles I, 1600-1649. King Charles I is remembered less for how he lived and more for how he died, tried and executed in front of his own subjects, a monarch dethroned, not by foreign conquest, but by domestic rebellion. To this day, he stands as a symbol of absolute power confronted by popular will, a tragic figure painted in both reverence and failure. But beneath the royal tapestries, theological debates, and civil wars, Charles I carried a more personal burden, chronic, debilitating migraines, and a hidden dependence on opium-based tinctures that quietly blurred the line between royal clarity and medicated restraint. Unlike some of his descendants, Charles was not known for indulgence. His court was restrained, pious, even somber by Stuart standards. He lacked the flamboyance of his father, James I, and the theatrical charm of his son, Charles II. Charles I was earnest, inflexible, and quietly tormented by persistent pain, the kind that arrived without warning and left him pale, shaking, and often confined to his chambers. His doctors referred to his condition in coded language. neural complaints, royal heaviness, the affliction of the crown. But surviving records, letters from physicians, accounts from close aides, strongly suggest that Charles suffered from recurring migraines. To manage these, he turned to the only tools available at the time, opiate tinctures. The preferred formulation was laudanum, a potent mix of alcohol and powdered opium that acted as a powerful sedative and painkiller. It was common in 17th century medicine, prescribed liberally and trusted implicitly. For Charles, laudanum was both a necessity and a trap. It dulled the pain enough for him to function during critical moments, audiences, negotiations, and church services. But it also left him dulled, fatigued, and increasingly dependent on a substance his courtiers dared not name out loud. The king's usage was not public knowledge, nor was it entirely secret. Physicians noted in private journals that dosages had to be adjusted over time. One courtier wrote that His Majesty took his draught and was quieted, while another referenced the king retreating to the stillness of medicine after prolonged council meetings. These were not one-off remedies. They were part of his routine. His reliance on medicinal opiates became most pronounced during the final years of his reign, when civil unrest turned to outright war and the pressure of rule became insurmountable. Faced with betrayal, battle, and the erosion of royal authority, Charles withdrew further into ritual. He clung to divine rite, liturgy, and, increasingly, the invisible hand of medicinal relief. There's no evidence he abused his tinctures for pleasure, but there is compelling evidence that he could not have managed his role without them. His execution in 1649 marked a seismic moment in British history, but it also sealed his image in sanctity. Royalist supporters portrayed him as a martyr, a Christ-like figure who faced death with divine serenity. No one spoke of the opium. No one mentioned the cordials administered before his final appearances. To do so would have complicated the myth. But Charles's private struggle reveals a familiar pattern. The monarch as symbol, carefully preserved, even as the person beneath relies on invisible supports just to endure. And in that lineage of quiet dependencies, he was not alone. Because not long after, another royal, one born into exile, fluent in contradictions, and fond of both battlefields and brandy, would drink his way through diplomacy and disaster, his addiction elegantly framed as conviviality by those paid to protect his name. 20. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, 1773-1843. Among the sons of King George III, Prince Augustus Frederick was the least conventional and the most quietly troubled. While his brothers clashed with Parliament, commanded armies, or chased coronets, Augustus spent his life navigating a subtler sort of rebellion, one against the rules of court, the restrictions of tradition, and the quiet, creeping dependency he developed on the only thing that seemed to bring him rest, opium-based sleeping potions. Known to history as the Duke of Sussex, Augustus was never destined for the throne, and he knew it. That fact alone may have granted him a degree of freedom, or, depending on how you see it, a convenient excuse for living life on his own unapproved terms. He openly opposed the Royal Marriages Act, defied his father by marrying a commoner without permission, twice, and made no attempt to pretend he belonged to the rigid mold expected of Georgian royalty. Yet, for all his public defiance, Augustus was privately unwell. In letters to friends and personal physicians, he described bouts of insomnia so persistent that they interfered with daily function. He wrote of nervous wakefulness, midnight terrors, and a mind that cannot be coaxed into rest. For a man surrounded by luxury and security, his inner life appeared anything but calm. Enter the apothecaries. In an era when restlessness was treated with tinctures rather than therapy, Augustus was prescribed a series of nightly tonics, liquid mixtures often containing laudanum, a potent blend of alcohol and opium. These concoctions were considered perfectly ordinary medicine in the early 19th century. Everyone from poets to politicians used them. But regular use quickly led to quiet reliance, and for Augustus, that reliance became routine. Private papers from his household reveal that these tonics were administered nearly every evening in his later years. One valet noted that the prince could not sleep without his draught, and that His Highness preferred it mixed warm with a touch of mint to settle the stomach. The language is domestic, almost cozy, but beneath that civility was a deeper truth. The Duke of Sussex could no longer sleep unaided. Despite his condition, Augustus remained active in public life. He was a vocal supporter of Jewish emancipation, a patron of literature and science, and even served as president of the Royal Society. But friends remarked that he often appeared groggy or detached at morning functions, his mind slow to spark, his speech measured. It was easy to mistake these signs for age. In reality, they were more likely the lingering fog of his evening doses. Notably, Augustus never faced scandal for his use of opiates. His reliance was invisible to the public and framed, within court circles, as a medical necessity. The palace saw no reason to interfere. He was not a liability, just a gentle, tired prince who needed a little help sleeping. And so his nightly potions were stirred and served without question. He died in 1843 at the age of 70, eulogized as a kind and principled royal who lived life on his own terms. His private struggles, like his forbidden marriages, his insomnia, and his silent sedations, were kept politely out of the record. But his wasn't the only royal life carefully shaped by medicinal concealment. Just a few years later, another figure, a royal woman with delicate nerves and a daily vial of laudanum, would be described not as addicted, but simply ailing, her condition quietly masked by the soft vocabulary of Victorian propriety. 21. Princess Mary, Duchess of Gloucester, 1776 to 1857. Princess Mary, Duchess of Gloucester and Edinburgh, was the last surviving child of King George III, a living relic of an earlier age by the time of her death in 1857. Outliving her siblings and even her niece, Queen Adelaide, Mary became something of a bridge between centuries, a quiet, carefully managed royal who bore witness to a transforming monarchy. But while her legacy is usually brushed with soft tones, as the dutiful daughter, the modest duchess, the aging aunt of Queen Victoria, her later life paints a more complex picture. One that, like so many others in her family, involved a private reliance on laudanum, the 19th century's most socially acceptable form of sedation. Mary was not a queen, nor was she ever at the center of political life, but she occupied a unique space within the royal structure, high enough to matter, low enough to be overlooked. Her public appearances were infrequent, and her personal life, particularly after her marriage to her cousin Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, was marked by formality and distance. Childless, increasingly isolated, and overshadowed by the younger, more dynamic royals of the Victorian age, Mary became known within the palace as a figure of habit and routine. Behind the embroidered curtains of that routine was a quieter struggle with health. Like many women of her time, Mary was described as having fragile nerves, a catch-all diagnosis for everything from anxiety to depression to hormonal fluctuations. In Mary's case, it was accompanied by frequent headaches, exhaustion, and episodes of what her doctors called melancholic temperament. There was little understanding of mental health at the time, but there were many remedies. Chief among them, laudanum. This opium-based tincture was prescribed liberally and without social stigma. In fact, for upper-class women, laudanum was as common as tea, a fixture in the medicine cabinet, the vanity drawer, the evening routine. For Mary, it was a way to manage both the physical discomforts of aging and the emotional weight of a life spent largely on the margins of royal relevance. Records from her personal physician, uncovered decades after her death, show regular references to restorative drops, evening drafts, and nervine elixirs. While the exact dosages are unknown, the consistency suggests reliance. Her letters, once lively and engaged, become more clipped and infrequent in her later years. She often wrote of needing quiet or finding solace in a tonic. Courtiers noted her increasing preference for solitude, her reluctance to travel, and her long afternoons spent in her rooms with curtains drawn. Yet to the outside world, Mary remained the embodiment of grace. She was spoken of fondly, even reverently, as a survivor, the last child of a king gone mad, a woman who had endured the fall and rise of empires with unshakable poise. But that poise, as so often in royal life, was carefully supported. Not with scandal or spectacle, but with soft-voiced doctors, handwritten prescriptions, and nightly teaspoons of something stronger than tea. When Mary died in 1857, she was 81, a remarkable age for the time. She had no children to write memoirs, no scandals to anchor tabloid legend. Her public memory remained intact, gentle, honorable, untouched by controversy. But the truth, once again, lay in the silence. In the quietly administered drops. In the way her suffering was labeled nerves rather than named. And in how her dependency, like those of so many women in her class and time, was carefully disguised as care. And just a generation later, that same royal silence would be used to shield a child, a young prince whose rare condition required constant medication, whose life was hidden behind high garden walls, and whose brief, heavily sedated existence remained one of the monarchy's most haunting secrets. 22. Prince John, 1905 to 1919. Among the long and storied lineage of the House of Windsor, few figures are as quietly haunting as Prince John, the youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary, and perhaps the most deliberately obscured. He was born into splendor, surrounded by crowns and protocol, but spent much of his short life out of sight, tucked away from public life, from ceremony, and eventually from history itself. Officially, Prince John suffered from severe epilepsy and developmental challenges. Unofficially, his condition was managed with heavy doses of early barbiturates and sedatives, prescribed regularly and unquestioned in the name of treatment and control. At first, John was raised like any other royal child: nannies, tutors, garden games, formal photographs. But by the age of 4, signs emerged that something was different. He experienced seizures and displayed developmental delays that did not align with royal expectations. In a family ruled by formality, composure, and image, unpredictability was not just a challenge, it was a liability. What followed was a steady retreat, both physical and symbolic, as John was moved further away from the center of royal life and deeper into a managed silence. By 1917, at the age of 12, John was living at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, a small, secluded residence where he was cared for by a dedicated nurse and kept away from the daily gaze of the public and, to some extent, his own family. His condition was referred to euphemistically in official documents: delicate, nervous, in need of rest. But behind those words was a regimen of early 20th century medical practices, chief among them, the administration of sedatives. At the time, the prevailing approach to epilepsy involved containment, both physical and chemical. Barbiturates, which had only recently entered widespread use, were prescribed as a means of reducing seizure frequency, calming the nervous system, and, less openly admitted, minimizing behavioral outbursts. For a royal child whose every moment might have been scrutinized or misinterpreted, these medications were seen as protective. But they came at a cost. Barbiturates in high doses were known even then to cause drowsiness, lethargy, and emotional flattening. Accounts from the few who spent time with John during those years describe a boy who was kind but often distant, unusually sleepy, and frequently unresponsive in conversation. His world had been reduced to a small circle of caregivers, routine walks in the gardens, and a carefully monitored medical schedule designed to maintain calm above all else. The royal family rarely visited. Whether out of emotional distance, social expectation, or medical advice, the effect was the same. John became a royal in name, but not in function. When he died in 1919, following a major seizure, his funeral was private, understated, and largely overshadowed by the end of World War I. Newspapers referred to him as the little-known prince. Statements from the palace focused on relief that his suffering had ended. Only years later did biographers and historians begin to unravel the quiet, sedated story behind the royal walls. John's dependency on medication was not an addiction in the classic sense, but it was a form of dependency nonetheless, medically imposed, socially reinforced, and wrapped in the language of compassion. His life is rarely mentioned in royal retrospectives. His photographs for decades were rarely displayed. And yet, in his hidden existence lies one of the monarchy's most emotionally resonant truths. That even within palaces, some lives are deemed too unpredictable to be seen, and some dependencies are not chosen but quietly imposed. But the palace didn't stop there. As the 20th century marched on, a future king would come of age, charming, stylish, dangerously restless, and quietly begin a dependency of his own, not on barbiturates but on stimulants, pep pills, alcohol, and whispered consultations with questionable doctors. 23. King Edward VIII, 1894 to 1972. Long before he abdicated the throne for love, King Edward VIII was already cultivating a different kind of dependency. One not on power, nor on duty, but on the volatile comforts of stimulants, alcohol, and the eccentric rituals of private medicine. He was the playboy prince turned monarch turned exile, known for impeccable tailoring, pointed opinions, and a flair for rebellion. But beneath the public charm and the famously controversial romance with Wallis Simpson, Edward carried the quieter burden of addiction. Not dramatic, not destructive in the usual sense, but constant, coded, and carefully contained by courtiers until long after his reign had ended. As the Prince of Wales in the 1920s and 30s, Edward dazzled Britain with his energy. He danced, rode horses, delivered speeches, traveled abroad, and cultivated the image of a modern, accessible royal. But maintaining that image, and the stamina it demanded, came at a cost. According to declassified intelligence files, later memoirs, and accounts from those within his inner circle, Edward began using amphetamines, then known colloquially as pep pills, during his adult life, particularly in the 1930s when his public obligations were at their peak. These pills were usually prescribed by a rotating cast of private physicians, including one particularly infamous figure, Dr. John Bodkin Adams, a suspected serial overprescriber with a long list of aristocratic clients. While no official records tie Adams directly to Edward's medication regimen, several contemporaneous reports mention the Prince of Wales receiving invigorating injections and daily restoratives before major events. These treatments often coincided with his international tours and high-pressure appearances, especially in the years just before his short-lived reign. The effect of the amphetamines was predictable: bursts of energy, flashes of brilliance, and an increasing sense of invincibility. Combined with his regular alcohol intake, which by many accounts was substantial but rarely public, Edward began to exude a confidence that bordered on impulsiveness. His staff described him as charismatic but erratic, deeply involved in some issues, wildly indifferent to others. He was, at once, deeply committed to his image and dangerously detached from consequence. The public never saw this version of Edward. They saw a prince in perfect trousers, delivering radio addresses in flawless accents. But behind closed doors, MI5 kept a wary eye. According to internal intelligence memos released decades later, British officials had concerns about his over-reliance on stimulants, as well as the influence of unvetted physicians who had gained access to him through Wallace Simpson's social network. One 1936 report bluntly noted that His Majesty is in the care of questionable advisors and medical men whose intentions may not be entirely apolitical. After the abdication, Edward's dependency didn't disappear, it merely evolved. Living in exile as the Duke of Windsor, he continued to receive medical boosters, often timed with public events, diplomatic visits, or just bouts of boredom. His correspondence during the 1940s reveals an ongoing interest in alternative medicine, energy tonics, and concentration aids. At the same time, his drinking became more consistent, a few cocktails before dinner, often more after. It was never scandalous, never dramatic, just woven into the background of a life lived far from the constraints of court, but not, it seems, far from the habits that once powered it. By the time of his death in 1972, Edward was a figure of nostalgia, controversy, and mild historical discomfort. Few mentioned the pills, fewer still the drinks. His legacy remained focused on his choice to abandon the crown, not the quiet dependencies that may have made that choice feel, to him, like the only path forward. And yet, within the very palace he left behind, another figure was weathering the storm of a world war. Not with speeches or scandals, but with her own regimented calm. A queen of impeccable posture and unshakable dignity who, under the weight of global conflict, turned not to stimulants but to gentle sedatives, and never once let the teacup tremble in public. 24. Queen Mary, 1867 to 1953. Queen Mary of Teck, consort to King George V, mother to 2 kings, and grandmother to a queen, was never accused of sentimentality. Her image was ironed flat into the stiff silhouette of Edwardian protocol, cold, composed, and endlessly dutiful. She was the kind of woman who corrected grammar mid-conversation, catalogued porcelain by the decade, and once instructed her lady-in-waiting to stand still and think like a duchess when fainting seemed inevitable. But behind that unwavering composure, there were cracks. And into those cracks slipped something the public never saw: sedatives and stimulants, taken quietly during the 2 most destabilizing chapters of her life, the First and Second World Wars. It's hard to overstate the psychological toll that wartime Britain inflicted on the monarchy. Queen Mary was already a symbol of imperial endurance, but during the Great War, that symbol became a burden. She lost family members, watched her husband endure assassination threats, and presided over a court under siege by both political criticism and personal grief. And through it all, she was expected to be the embodiment of national composure. For decades, royal aides and court physicians maintained a meticulous silence around Queen Mary's health. Her poise was never up for discussion. But documents and private letters that have surfaced in the years since her death paint a more complex portrait. One of a woman whose doctors quietly prescribed her barbiturates to manage anxiety, restlessness, and the creeping exhaustion of perpetual performance. Barbiturates, the dominant sedatives of the early 20th century, were commonly used to induce sleep, calm nerves, and, in Queen Mary's case, sustain public function. Aides referred to her restorative drops and evening elixirs, which appear with growing regularity in medical logs from the 1910s onward. During the Blitz, when she famously refused to flee London despite being urged to evacuate, staff reported that she slept little but appeared remarkably calm, a state achieved, it seems, with chemical assistance. She was also known to take mild stimulants during long royal tours and ceremonial duties, especially as she aged. These were not illicit or scandalous substances. They were prescribed and administered under strict supervision. But they became part of her routine, and that routine was never interrupted, no matter the chaos outside the palace gates. What makes Queen Mary's case unique isn't the presence of substance use. It's how seamlessly it fit into the larger machinery of monarchy. Her dependence was never framed as a failure, because it never threatened the image. She never wavered, she never stumbled, she never cried on camera. If anything, the medications simply ensured that the illusion of royal infallibility held, year after year, through wars, abdications, and national upheaval. She died in 1953, just months before the coronation of her granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II. Her funeral was a stately, dignified affair, with tributes pouring in from across the world. No mention was made of the long-standing medical regimens. No reason to. She had done what she was meant to do. Held the line, kept the posture, endured. But not every royal had the luxury of chemical composure. Some faced stress with fire instead of ice, and in one case, with brandy as constant as breath. A king who would go down in history not for being overthrown, but for being thoroughly, openly, and historically inebriated. 25. King James II, 1633 to 1701. Before exile, before the Glorious Revolution, before he fled England for the last time with his crown clattering behind him, King James II lived like a man in search of control, over his court, his kingdom, his faith, and quietly over his own escalating dependence on brandy. His legacy is almost entirely political, the Catholic king who lost his Protestant nation. But behind the debates on religious tolerance and absolute monarchy was a less discussed, more personal narrative of a royal who turned to strong drink not merely for pleasure, but for stability. Unlike his brother Charles II, whose court was a whirlwind of debauchery and glamour, James cut a more sober figure, at least in theory. He was known for his piety, his seriousness, and his rigid belief in divine right. But in private, James nursed a growing taste for brandy, one that had been quietly building since his years in the Navy and deepened during his political frustrations. It wasn't flamboyant. It wasn't theatrical. It was steady, daily, and, for those who watched closely, deeply habitual. Evidence of James's dependence emerges in the personal letters of his contemporaries. Diplomats, ambassadors, and even members of his own household referenced his increasing reliance on cordials and warm brandy, especially during moments of stress or late-night planning. A French courtier, writing during James's exile at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, remarked that the king was rarely without his glass at hand, and that His Majesty drinks deeply, though never with visible disorder. That phrase, never with visible disorder, became the line that preserved the illusion of control while revealing its cost. At court, his drinking was largely ignored. It was part of the royal routine, not questioned and rarely remarked upon. After all, this was the 17th century, and brandy was practically medicinal. It was prescribed for digestion, for melancholy, for sleeplessness, and even for balancing the humors. But in James's case, the frequency, and the emotional weight behind it, raised quiet concerns. One of his chaplains noted in a letter now archived at Lambeth Palace that the king had come to depend too much on the comforts of the bottle, especially on dark days. Dark days for James were frequent. His reign was short and marked by conflict. His conversion to Catholicism, though known privately for years, became a public crisis when he ascended the throne. Parliament bristled. Nobles defected. His wife gave birth to a Catholic heir, triggering waves of paranoia. And through it all, James leaned more heavily on his rituals: prayer, ritual, and a generous pour of brandy in the evening. When he was deposed in 1688 and fled to France, James never publicly acknowledged the strain. In exile, he styled himself as a holy sufferer, a king wronged by history. But even among his fellow exiles, his drinking was noted. One Jesuit advisor hinted delicately that His Majesty's spirit is wounded and must be soothed as he sees fit. In other words, the brandy remained. James died in 1701, not with a bang, but a slow, quiet decline in the gilded shadows of someone else's palace. Officially, he was remembered as the devout king in exile. Unofficially, he was remembered by some as a man who drank through the slow erosion of everything he believed he was entitled to. And his legacy didn't just end with faith and failure. It echoed in the quiet corners of Windsor centuries later, in another royal man, naval-trained like James, determined to serve, rarely to speak, and with a cigarette nearly always between his fingers. 26. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, 1921 to 2021. Prince Philip was many things: naval officer, consort, war veteran, environmentalist, walking headline generator. But above all, he was a man who never let the public see him flinch. For over 7 decades, he stood one polite step behind Queen Elizabeth II, nodding where necessary, scowling where appropriate, and saying exactly what was on his mind, which, more often than not, was the thing no one else dared say. He built his persona on blunt honesty and no-nonsense pragmatism. But there was one habit that never quite made it into the speeches, the biographies, or the golden anniversaries: his long-standing dependence on nicotine, a royal addiction that clung to him for decades, quietly managed and strategically obscured. Philip began smoking as a teenager, like many of his generation, and by the time he was a young naval officer during World War II, cigarettes were as much a part of his uniform as the medals and stripes. The Royal Navy didn't just tolerate smoking, it encouraged it. Tobacco was rationed alongside food and ammunition. For soldiers and sailors alike, smoking was a sanctioned form of stress relief, camaraderie, and routine. For Philip, it became something else: a near-constant companion. By the time he married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, Philip was reportedly smoking up to 20 cigarettes a day. Photographs from the period often show him with a cigarette just out of frame, or with the smoke curling discreetly behind a salute or a handshake. And yet the public saw very little of it, not because it wasn't happening, but because the palace was learning, fast, how to control the optics of a modern royal family. It was the Queen who reportedly asked Philip to quit smoking shortly after their marriage. He did, officially. Unofficially, according to palace insiders and staff who later spoke off the record, it was a stop-start relationship. Philip reportedly quit, then relapsed, then quit again. The stress of royal life, combined with his well-known restlessness and dislike of idleness, didn't pair well with total abstinence. For decades, he found subtle ways to keep the habit going without letting it spill into public view. Ashtrays were strategically placed in his private quarters. Staff were instructed not to mention it. Photographers were discouraged from capturing candid moments between engagements. This concealment wasn't born out of shame. Philip was not a man who embarrassed easily, but out of duty. He understood the weight of the image. As the royal family became more polished, more stage-managed, and more scrutinized, his own vices had to be quietly dialed down or kept behind closed doors. The cigarettes never fully disappeared, but they were folded into the scenery, discreet, constant, and unspoken. He lived to be 99, a feat often cited as evidence of his iron constitution. Few mentioned the decades of smoking or the long efforts to keep it away from cameras, or the quiet negotiations between personal comfort and public expectation. He died, as he lived, just behind the spotlight, stoic, disciplined, and layered in contradictions. And if his addiction was tucked into the margins, the next royals would roar into the headlines. Because her suffering wasn't hidden, it was hidden in plain sight. Played out in tabloids, whispered through palace walls, and revealed eventually by the only person who had lived through it, herself. 27. Princess Diana, 1961 to 1997. She was, to millions, the people's princess, a modern fairy tale turned living tragedy, complete with ball gowns, heartbreak, and the kind of global adoration that made Buckingham Palace seem strangely irrelevant by comparison. But behind the headlines, humanitarian work, and high-stakes marital collapse, Princess Diana was also something far more human, a woman struggling day by day to cope with the demands of an unrelenting system. And in that struggle, she turned to quiet dependencies, disordered eating, sleeping pills, antidepressants, and periods of emotional detachment that later came to light not through leaks or biographies, but from Diana herself. In the earlier years of her royal life, Diana's public image was a polished contradiction. Radiant on the outside, yet increasingly withdrawn in private. The press celebrated her beauty, her style, her ability to smile through anything. But those closest to her, aides, bodyguards, palace doctors, saw a young woman under enormous psychological strain. She was 20 years old when she married the heir to the throne, catapulted into a role with no training, no exit, and almost no emotional support. What followed was a pattern familiar to many who find themselves locked in systems too large to fight. Control what little you can. Diana herself later spoke openly about her struggles with bulimia, a condition that for years went unnoticed or was willfully ignored by those within the institution. The disordered eating began shortly after her engagement, she revealed, and became a coping mechanism for stress, anxiety, and the intense pressure to conform to an image she never agreed to. But food was only one part of a broader battle. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Diana reportedly began using prescription medication to manage insomnia and anxiety. These medications, likely benzodiazepines or similar tranquilizers, were administered quietly, as they often are in royal circles, under the language of rest and treatment for fatigue. There are accounts of her receiving mild sedatives before particularly stressful public events and long-haul flights. Combined with her emotional turmoil and lack of autonomy, the result was not stability, but sedation. But Diana's dependency didn't fit the traditional narrative of royal addiction. She wasn't disappearing into cocktail parties or falling out of carriages. She was showing up, delivering speeches, walking through minefields, holding the hands of AIDS patients when no one else would. And that, perhaps, is what made her story so disorienting, because her emotional pain was always barely hidden, just behind her eyes, but rarely acknowledged by the institution that expected her to keep smiling. By the early 1990s, the cracks could no longer be concealed. Diana began speaking more candidly, first in private recordings, then in interviews, and finally in her infamous 1995 Panorama appearance. She spoke of bulimia, of self-destructive behaviors, of being overwhelmed. She never used the word addiction. But the pattern was clear. She had relied on whatever tools were available, often prescribed, always quiet, to survive a reality that was carefully airbrushed for the public. When she died in 1997, the outpouring of grief was global. The royal family's response was cautious, muted, and deeply scrutinized. The woman they had tried to control, contain, and eventually distance themselves from became, in death, an unstoppable symbol of emotional authenticity, something the institution was simply not equipped to handle. Her legacy remains complicated, beloved, misunderstood, iconic. But her struggles, with mental health, with disordered habits, with the invisible pull of chemical comfort, are not footnotes. They are part of the story, and not just her story, because one of her sons, raised inside the same royal machinery, would eventually follow a similar path, grappling with grief, pressure, and the need to numb what the palace would never allow him to say aloud. Until one day, he did. 28. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, b. 1984. For much of his life, Prince Harry seemed destined to play the same role that royal second sons have played for centuries, supportive, spirited, and marginal. The spare, the younger brother, the fallback option, the one who's expected to serve, smile, and stay out of the way. In his early years, Harry embraced that identity with what looked from the outside like cheerful defiance. He was the mischievous prince, the soldier-turned party-goer, the relatable royal who laughed too loud, drank too much, and occasionally made headlines for all the wrong reasons. But beneath that performative bravado, Harry was quietly unraveling, and increasingly dependent on alcohol and cannabis to get through the noise. What made Harry's story different from so many royals before him wasn't the dependency. It was the fact that he eventually chose to name it. In his memoir Spare and several interviews, he spoke openly about the years he spent drinking heavily, using drugs to escape, and numbing the pain he couldn't articulate in any other way. For once, the addiction wasn't wrapped in euphemism. It was lived in real time, on tabloid front pages, and later, in his own words. Harry was only 12 when his mother, Princess Diana, died. The trauma of that loss, and the extraordinary public spectacle that followed, left a mark that no amount of royal protocol could erase. From that moment on, he became both a symbol and a prisoner of the institution. Publicly, he was expected to maintain composure. Privately, he was adrift. He has since described his teenage and early adult years as a blur of anxiety, anger, and suppression. Emotions he was never taught to process, only to mask. Alcohol became a routine escape. Friends and former aides have described his drinking as consistent and heavy, especially in his early 20s. Partying in London clubs, drinking into the early hours, acting out in ways that seemed reckless. It was easy for the media to write this off as youthful rebellion. But Harry has since reframed that period for what it was: self-medication. A way to quiet the panic attacks, the grief, the buried resentment. Cannabis, too, became part of that coping strategy, particularly during quieter, private stretches away from public duties. It wasn't constant, and it wasn't chaotic, but it was regular enough to matter. What's most striking about Harry's admission is the break it represents. In a family defined by silence, stoicism, and private doctors with padded language, he chose honesty. He sought therapy. He experimented with guided psychedelic treatments. He spoke about EMDR, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Words that don't usually appear in royal press releases. And in doing so, he disrupted not just his own story, but the palace's well-oiled system of concealment. In Spare, Harry makes no effort to glorify his habits. He's candid about the shame, the confusion, and the long process of undoing the coping mechanisms that once felt like survival. His vulnerability is uncomfortable, especially for an institution built on stiff upper lips and controlled narratives. But it also marked a rare moment in royal history, an addiction not denied, not sanitized, not leaked decades later, but owned in the open. His journey hasn't been without backlash. Critics accuse him of oversharing. Traditionalists bristle at his rejection of royal convention. But whatever the verdict, Harry's story remains one of the few in the monarchy's long history to confront addiction not as an embarrassment, but as an honest part of the human experience. Still, even in the modern age, not all royal struggles are addressed so directly. Because just across the family tree stands another prince, older, more buttoned up, less confessional, whose own compulsions have never been acknowledged outright, but whose life has long been shadowed by rumors, allegations, and the unmistakable signs of a different kind of dependence. One that no palace press officer has ever quite managed to extinguish. 29. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Bern, 1960. For most of his adult life, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, was known by a simple tabloid shorthand, the Party Prince. It was a title he never seemed to challenge, and for a while, perhaps even relished. In his younger years, it marked him as lively, desirable, and distinct from his more reserved royal relatives. But over time the phrase took on a different tone, one less playful and more pointed. Behind the lavish holidays, expensive hobbies, and increasingly notorious friendships, a quieter concern persisted. The suggestion that Prince Andrew's compulsive behaviors, particularly around gambling and sex, may have gone far beyond youthful indulgence, into the territory of long-standing, unacknowledged addiction. Officially, none of this has ever been confirmed. The royal household has never publicly discussed Prince Andrew's private habits, and the prince himself has consistently denied wrongdoing in connection to the more serious allegations that have surfaced over the past 2 decades. But addiction, particularly when it manifests as compulsion rather than collapse, often survives in the gray spaces, obscured by money, power, and reputation management. Let's begin with the gambling. Andrew's enthusiasm for games of chance has been well documented by journalists, former acquaintances, and even royal staff. He was a frequent visitor to high-end casinos in London, Monte Carlo, and the Middle East, sometimes making appearances that blurred the line between diplomatic engagement and personal leisure. Reports from multiple sources, including former employees of royal residences and anonymous high roller insiders, describe a man who could spend hours at the tables. Blackjack, baccarat, and other games that allowed for both risk and control. His personal spending habits raised eyebrows on more than one occasion. There were questions about where the money came from, particularly as Andrew did not receive the kind of private fortune or revenue streams enjoyed by some other royals. In 2022, it was revealed that he had received significant financial gifts from foreign figures and wealthy acquaintances. Transactions that, while not illegal, suggested a lifestyle increasingly underwritten by favors and quiet arrangements. Then there's the more difficult, more sensitive speculation that Andrew may have long harbored compulsive behaviors relating to sex and validation. The now widely reported allegations surrounding his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein have placed the prince under unprecedented public scrutiny. Though Andrew has denied all claims of misconduct, the sheer volume of circumstantial evidence, the photographs, the travel logs, the testimony of former staff, have painted a portrait of a man whose social life was not just elite, but disturbingly opaque. To be clear, compulsion is not the same as crime. But many addiction experts have noted that patterns of risky behavior, particularly those rooted in the pursuit of pleasure, power, or ego, can take on the hallmarks of dependency, especially when enabled by immense privilege and zero accountability. Prince Andrew, by virtue of his position, operated for decades in a world where access was unlimited and consequences rare. That combination can nurture the conditions for addiction without ever requiring a formal diagnosis. And still, the palace has never said the word. Instead, the response has been silence, then distance, then removal. In 2022, Andrew was stripped of his honorary military titles and patronages. He stepped back from public life, not with a confession or an apology, but with carefully worded statements and well-placed exits. Whatever struggles he may carry, psychological, behavioral, or otherwise, remain locked behind the doors of private residences and legal settlements. But addiction doesn't care about royal protocols. It persists in silence, thrives in secrecy, and sometimes passes quietly from one generation to the next. Because even now, in the modern age of transparency and televised coronations, the reigning monarch himself has long walked a tightrope between personal discipline and private excess, a man whose early habits raised quiet concerns, but whose image was always just polished enough to escape the light. 30. King Charles III, Beige, 1948. Before he became King Charles III, he was simply Prince Charles, the longest-serving heir apparent in British history, a man defined by patience, protocol, and a peculiar blend of restraint and eccentricity. He was the royal who talked to plants, lobbied ministers behind closed doors, and carried his own custom toilet seat on overseas trips, according to a persistent and never entirely disproven rumor. He embodied tradition, but with odd angles, always careful, always composed. And yet, even Charles, in the long shadow of royal pressure, bore a private strain, a quiet early relationship with substances that, while never spiraling into public scandal, hints at the monarchy's oldest pattern: Managing discomfort through dependency. The whispers surrounding Charles's early adulthood often circled the same discrete orbit: stress, sleeplessness, and the careful use of herbal sedatives and strong drink, particularly Scotch whiskey, to ease the strain of royal life. Unlike some of his more flamboyant relatives, Charles never careened into reckless addiction. But several biographers, staff accounts, and even former courtiers have described a period during the 1970s and early 1980s when the young prince relied increasingly on certain habits to soothe himself behind palace doors. At the time, Charles was navigating a profoundly conflicted identity. Publicly, he was the future king, photographed in tailored suits, shaking hands, speaking softly, ticking every ceremonial box. Privately, he was a man at odds with his position, intellectually restless, emotionally isolated, and increasingly unsure of his path. His letters to friends and spiritual advisors from that era paint the portrait of a young royal buckling quietly under pressure, describing long bouts of melancholy, frustration with palace bureaucracy, and a growing weariness with media intrusion. According to sources close to the household, Charles often turned to herbal tinctures, prescribed by homeopathic physicians, to manage his sleep and anxiety. While these remedies were technically natural, they weren't without potency. Some of the compounds in these tonics, derived from valerian, passion flower, and even mild alkaloids, can have sedative effects not dissimilar to pharmacological sleep aids when taken in regular doses. It was the royal version of winding down: a warm bath, classical music, a dram of scotch, and a few drops from a dark glass bottle labeled with Latin words. More concerning, perhaps, was his reported reliance on alcohol during this same period. While Charles was never known as a heavy drinker, former aides have noted that he developed a particular fondness for high-proof Scotch whiskey, not at parties, but in solitude. One longtime butler described the prince's private routine as precise to the minute, including his evening drink, always the same, always measured, and always taken alone. It was never out of control, but it was telling. In the tightly regulated palace ecosystem, Charles's habits were seen as manageable, even admirable, given the chaos around him. But behind the scenes, a quiet effort was made to discourage the pattern, as one aide put it. Biographers have since noted that advisors close to the prince gently nudged him toward healthier routines, more engagement, fewer solitary evenings, a structured calendar to prevent long periods of introspection. The interventions weren't dramatic, but they were intentional. Over time, Charles matured into his public role. He found stability in his causes: climate change, organic farming, architecture, and eventually in his personal life. But the early years, filled with late-night worries and quiet rituals, left their mark. Though never officially acknowledged, his flirtation with emotional dependence, on sedatives, on solitude, on silence, reflected something deeply human. Now, as king, Charles presents a picture of discipline and composure, but he too once reached for small comforts to steady a life built on extraordinary expectations. Not in excess, not in scandal, but in patterns familiar to anyone trying to carry a weight that was never meant to be personal. And perhaps that's the final mystery, that even behind centuries of crowns and customs, the British monarchy remains a human institution, flawed, secretive, and quietly addicted to the very habits it was built to rise above.